Hi everyone, this is Scott with US Ignite again. This is my third video in my video series on Docker. Today I'm going to cover Docker Hub and private registries, how to commit Docker images and Docker containers to images, and interact with Docker registries and Docker Hub itself. If you remember last episode, I talked a little bit about the workflow. Generally, the workflow is you pull down images from either a private registry or Docker Hub. And if you're building a new image, you will start with some base image. So there's always some official image at Docker that you'll start with and then build onto it, even if you have an image of your own. You'll pull it down from some registry down to your local drive. That image then will be available to launch and run as a container. You might modify that container, do other things to it, and you might want to save that as an additional image, so you'll save it back to a local image, and then you'll be able to push it up to either a private registry or Docker Hub again. So that's the essential workflow. It's very similar. People compare it often to Git, so that's something we'll do here again. So it's very Git-like in terms of its ability to version images, to tag them with versions, and kind of keep them in this Docker Hub, which is an analog almost to GitHub. Just as GitHub provides a social coding experience, Docker Hub provides a social disk image experience, as well as a way to rate those images and so forth. And just like Git is a version control system that runs on its own, it runs on your operating system. And GitHub is a service built on top of Git. Docker Hub is a service built on top of Docker. Most of what we're going to see here in terms of committing to Docker Hub we can do from command line, and you should get to know that because often you'll interact with private registries. Again, the analog to think about this is Git and GitHub. It's very apt in terms of its comparison. All right, so let's exit out of this and get over to Docker Hub and take a look. Docker Hub allows you to register for free. So you can go ahead and create an account out here in Docker Hub. I think by default it gives Streamweaver with capital. I must have typed that at some time. But you will need to create with lowercase a user ID and a password. It's a free registry. I think you get unlimited free or unlimited public Docker repositories. I think one private repository for free, but you'll need to do a paid account if you want to do private repositories, very similar to GitHub. So the reason why you want to go lowercase in your name is that your username in your Docker Hub account becomes the namespace for all Docker images that you create and push to Docker Hub. So it's a way to it's a unique identifier, and it should be persistent, and it should be something you can use often. So I'll go ahead and log in here. So these are the repositories I create. These are my personal ones. They're not part of an organization I belong into. Just like you can on GitHub, you can create Docker Hub organizations. You can add team members to those. But this is just my private one. I keep a bunch of little images for different things that I do, and there's one at the bottom I'm just using for the demo here today. But if you look into my organizations, for instance, I'll see US Ignite. I created one here for it. There's no one else in it but me right now. You can just like GitHub, you can create repositories under that organization. You can add people to the organization and add teams. Teams can have any one of 3 permissions. It's read, write, or admin. They're not very granular, so it's to the organization's entire repository. So that's not as granular as you'd want, or you might get, let's say, in GitHub teams, but hopefully that will mature soon. I think I did a test team here, but I don't have anybody to add to it right away. Teams and owners, yeah, you can see I belong to it. And you can provide permissions to those teams. There's billing settings. Billing's comparable really to GitHub. So if your team thinks it needs private repositories, and there's a number of reasons for that, you might want to take a look at what's required there. Settings provide typical settings for the organization, name, location, things like that. But let's go back to the dashboard. All right, you can search for images or explore. Explore is a good way to uncover. As you can see, as I said, your username namespaces all of the repositories. If I go to explore though, this gives me the most commonly pulled and highest rated image repositories here on Docker Hub. If you remember yesterday's, the previous episode, it may not be yesterday for you, I talked a little bit about official images. So you saw on my Docker Hub repositories, it's Streamweaver / the image name And those might be differentiated by tag as well. Here, the top ones you're seeing don't have the username in front of them. That means they're official repositories. So Nginx is an official build out of the Nginx team to Docker and Docker Hub. It comes trusted from that image. Ubuntu, same thing. There's a Docker registry Docker image you can pull down to spawn a Docker container. I just love saying that because it's really weirdly redundant. Redis, Swarm, the whole bit like that. So as you can see, the most popular images out on Docker Hub are official builds. People often start there because they know it's a trusted build. That trusted doesn't mean not that it has no vulnerabilities though, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. On these official images, I'll look over in tags. So I mentioned tags as a way to version images. So this will give you a couple things all at once. So if I look over in the Ubuntu registry, I'll have a bunch of tagged images right here. And I'll cover the scan piece in a second. But as I mentioned yesterday, tags on a Docker image are free text. They can be whatever you want. Their convention for doing it over at Ubuntu is to often use the version number, so you can get 16.4, you can get 15.10, all the way back. I usually use 14.4. Quite a few people do. Latest is the convention for the latest build of that image, and if you don't specify a tag when you try to pull down an image, it will by default use latest. And then they do other things like give it the Xenial name and what date it was done by, and those are sort of intermediate builds. Those tend to be a little bit more ephemeral. One of the nice things though on official builds, and this only happens for official builds, it won't happen on your repository. It pulls a security scan out of Docker Cloud, and I'll get to that in a second. But it basically pulls back, does that image have vulnerabilities? So there's critical, severe, and I think notification is what the orange is for. They don't have a key guide here that I know of, but that gives you a level of vulnerability there are. And that's actually quite alarming. Quite a few of these images have some sort of vulnerability by default. They don't have a lot of more information about what that vulnerability is, so that's you can't do much to mitigate it for when you get it. But if you do a little Googling and searching on Stack Overflow, I'm sure somebody will have that information. But it is good to at least have it. If you go back to Trusty, there's some critical vulnerabilities, as well as some intermediate and some warnings. And there's only some intermediate vulnerabilities on the latest build, so at least that's good. But that is the service provided out of .cloud. If you have a container or an image that you're putting up to .cloud to run as a container, .cloud is the Docker's official hosting service. As I've been saying a lot, the Docker's is a whole environment, a whole ecosystem of Docker stuff out there. This is their hosting service. You can pay for hosting, much like you can do in AWS or something like that. One of the services that they provide as part of that is they scan an image that you might upload for vulnerabilities. They don't put that in your repository. However, for these official images, they take the results of that and put them over in the official repository information, so you'll get some data about the vulnerability status of that. So often people, as I said, use these base images, these official images, as their base images for building images of their own. And that's a nice feature. All right, so that's a little bit tour of tags and the security warnings and all that stuff. You can see also there's a few other details about the stars. Users here on GitHub can rate repositories with the number of stars they think that it deserves, and how many pulls it's had and so forth. The star system usually is pretty good. It's an indicator of what people are using, so it's not gamed very much, and I very much enjoy that about this. You can get a description of it. That's dependent on the committer adding good notes, just like sort of a GitHub README, so that's something to be aware of. But often, especially in these official images, they provide you with quite a bit in terms of flexibility to run the image as a container and instructions about the image itself. So that's a nice feature. You can search and get in Docker Hub just like you can Git. So let's Nginx, pull back a bunch of Nginx images that people have done, and they set it up in different ways. So there's a lot to be examined there. I think it automatically filters by relevancy in terms of stars and number of polls. So that's helpful. And you can do multiple searches here. And this when I get to command line searches, I'll let you know why I'm doing this in a second. So this lets you do, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do pull, I meant to do PHP. PHP. So that pulls back a bunch of results for Nginx and PHP. It looks like it does full text search, so it's distance as well as recognizing official repositories to the top of the list. But so it's pretty simple full text search algorithm that seems to be using there. All right. So last bit is official repositories. I'm not going to get, excuse me, automatic build repositories. I'm not going to get too much into auto build. I'm going to do that in the Dockerfile video I'm going to do a little bit later. But I do want to cover, so you can, there's two types of repositories that you get in Docker. There's an automatic build repository. You can see I have 3 of them here. And then there's a regular repository. Regular repositories are very much like Git push and Git pull on GitHub. So in other words, you're building those on your disk locally, manually building them with commands. You're manually committing them to your disk, and then you're using a push command to push them up to Docker Hub itself. And so versioning is very much like Git and GitHub. Automatic builds, however, take a Docker file that you will use to actually create an image, and I'll get more into this in the Dockerfile video, but Dockerfile basically, what you want to do is get an image that's 99% of the way you need to the way you need to get something to. Then you create a Docker file to add additional commands, services, files, whatever needs to be done, define volumes, and then that's the way you build the next image layer for it. So here, if it's an automatic build, there'll be a Docker file associated with it. Now, and that's actually hosted over on GitHub, and by providing some webhooks, when I do commit to GitHub, it does a build of that image over in Docker Hub, and then I can pull it down to my system. But you can see the definition of that Docker file here. I keep Jekyll for my personal website, so you can see latest. I use Ubuntu latest as the base image, and then I run some apt-get options to actually install Jekyll and Ruby gems and Ruby and all that stuff, and then I make sure that I have the Jekyll source as a volume, so it's not committing my web pages, it's just the binaries. I expose the port for the Jekyll server, make sure that I'm in the working directory, and all commands that I issue to that image when I run it as a container will start with Jekyll by default. So that's how that's a similar paradigm for all automatic build Docker hubs. One got you is once you can't switch back and forth between types of repositories, at least not right now that I know of, unless that's a new feature. If something's an automated repository, it has to stay an automated repository, and likewise with non-automated regular repositories. You have to delete the repository and rebuild it if you want to switch between them, which is really a big pain in the butt, but I guess understandable given what kind of scripts have to run in the background. But just be aware of that. So you want to know up ahead of time what type of repository you're going to create when you go ahead and do it. All right, so let's get to command line stuff. So there's quite a bit you can do from command line with with Docker repositories and Docker Hub. And one of the things to realize, although I've just showed you Docker Hub, just like Git and GitHub, Docker repositories are their own thing. GitHub is a service on top of a Docker repository that they run at Docker itself, but you can run your own private repository. And just like a Git repository, if you run one locally, you're going to have to do it all through command line or build your own web interface and so forth. You're not going to get a Docker Hub-like interface to it, but most of these things you can do from command line, and I'm going to do a lot of that right here. First is you can log into Docker with the Docker login command. Let me log out first. So at command line, it's logged me out. You stay logged in once you're logged in. So be aware that if you logged in a while ago, you may not realize it if you're letting somebody else use your computer or using a shared computer. It does not log you out automatically. So that's something to be aware of. Make sure you're logging yourself out. Even if you end a bash session, it does not log you out. So Docker login. And Streamweaver, and I'm now logged into my Docker repository. Again, lowercase names, I tend to forget and put in uppercase in it, and it'll give you some error. On Docker Hub website itself, it'll automatically cast it as lowercase, but that's a bit of a pain. You can search Docker repositories with the Docker search command. I did Nginx earlier. Oops, Docker search Nginx. That'll pull back all the repositories with Nginx in them. It'll tell you how many stars, whether it's official or whether it's automated build and so forth. Yeah, you can get quite a bit in terms of search results back. You can do multiple terms with a quote. So Docker search. So let me show you without quote first. If you try to do that, it'll give you an error. But if you, let's say you want to, what image repositories with Nginx and PHP in them, if you hit return with quotes, it'll give you a lot of those back. The search, the results don't come back in the exact order that I see over on the Docker Hub website. However, I notice it's the same set. So I don't know what the ordering algorithm is, but it looks like the exact same set that you get from the Docker Hub search. So that's important to know. And you can do a few other things like specify the number of stars that are the minimum that you want to get back for a repository. So let's say you wanted to only do things with 100 and above. That's going to, by this search result, you'll see it should return just 3 repositories. So stars 100 or above, it'll give me the 3 repositories back for that. So that's, and the number of stars is usually pretty significant about what people are using and what people find helpful. So I at least find it helpful to determine which one to use. One of the downsides of this, though, is you can't view the tags for a repository through the command line. So let's say I have this, if you went over to the Nginx repository, or any repository really, you can see that it has a number of tag versions, and you usually want to get in the habit of pulling a specific tag version or latest, obviously, if you want. However, these have a lot of vulnerabilities. However, you can't really easily view that from command line in Docker, and that's a little frustrating. And everyone's asked for that feature. Hopefully, we'll see it soon. There are some third-party tools you can do that with, and some kind of curl tricks you can do to pull down information about repository. But they're all kind of clunky. I don't want to get into them here too, because I want to stick with the standard Docker tools for what you can do. Obviously, just look at the web page and you can see what you need to do. Might be worth noting though that let me see, Docker images. Let me see what I have in my system currently. So I've already pulled, let me get rid of this Nginx latest. Docker, if you're going to remove an image from your system, I don't think I've covered this before. Removing a container, you use Docker rm, remove, as you would normally. To remove an image, you need to do RMI, so remove image. Nginx, and that will delete it. It defaults to latest if you don't put a tag in there. And that's something I wanted to show you since I just noticed that about the Nginx. There's no latest tagged version in the Nginx repository. So they didn't sit down and make a specific tag named latest in Nginx. They're all free tagged with the version stable Alpine and all that kind of stuff. However, latest is always the default for the most recently committed image type. So if I were to, I'm getting a little out of order here, but if I would do Docker pull is the way you pull a repository from Docker Hub, or you can specify a private repository instead with the command line flag. But let's pull an image from Docker repository. Let's pull down the Nginx image I just deleted. So if I Docker images, you can see Nginx is no longer on my system. I had Nginx latest. So if I pull Docker pull Nginx latest. Now there is no Nginx latest tag in the actual Nginx repository, as you just saw. However, it knows that means pull the last built image from the Nginx repository down. So that's what it's doing. So if I Docker images again, it does do that. I usually make a habit of actually specifically tagging the latest build. In my mind, that's sort of similar to the master branch in GitHub. A lot of people don't do it, and I don't know that there's agreement on what the best practice is. I usually make a specific latest branch though, because I hate to leave it to an algorithm to determine what people should be pulling down. Things should be as explicit as possible, especially with disk images. If somebody else is going to use it or you're working in a team, you should never leave it up to sort of serendipity for them to get the right image. You should, in my opinion, always have an explicit tag named latest, and that should just be, you can even do a latest and develop and all that kind of stuff. But it's sort of up to you how you want to arrange that paradigm. Work it out with your team to see what works best. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new image and push it up to Docker Hub. So as you see, I was practicing a little bit before, and I have the Streamweaver MyUbuntu 0.1. All I did with that actually is pull out the Ubuntu latest image. I added a directory to the opt folder, and then I saved it. So I'm going to do that again. So if I create a new container, the option is so the workflow is you take an image, you create a new container from it, you make modifications to that container, you commit those to a new image, and then you push that image, a new image or a new image tag. Often it's a new image image tag, and then you push that up to Docker Hub. So that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to run a container from Streamweaver mybuntu 01. So Docker run. I'm going to hit IT, and I'm going to just do a bash shell to add a directory to it. Streamweaver mybuntu 01. That's the image I want to run the container from, and I'll give it a command, bin bash. Oop, I actually typed that wrong. So you see I typed that, since it's a text, I typed 01 instead of 0.1. It can't find it and errors out. Had I not given it any tag, it would have just given me the latest from the Docker Hub repository, which is another reason why you don't want to do that a lot. You want to always be explicit about your tags. So mybuntu 01 bin bash pops me right to the root of, it gives me bin bash and gives me the root user, and I'm right at the root of the image. So if I look in opt, there's the test directory I created before, so I'm going to add a new directory, opt test2, and then I'm going to exit. Exiting automatically exits the container, so I can see Sleepy Stonebreaker. That was automatically named, by the way. So I'm going to go save that. I'm going to take that container that's exited, and I'm going to commit that to a new Docker Hub image. So I'm going to docker commit. Give it a commit message, just like you second version. So the other was initial version. Actually, first let me go ahead and show you. You can actually do a diff on containers to the image that it was created from. You can see in this container listing, it's giving you the image it was created from. So let me do docker diff sleepy Stonebreaker. And it tells you copy, added, or there'll be a delete option D if something has happened. So it knows that, change, not copy, sorry, change. So it's changed the opt directory. It knows that by adding the test2 directory I just added, there'll always be that root and root bash if you get a bash shell into it. So those are incidental, but the meaningful changes are opt. The opt directory was changed by adding the test2 directory to it. So you can do that. One downside though is there's no easy way to diff between two image layers in Docker that I know of. You can go ahead and use Docker save command to save an image as a tar file and put it out to disk, and then you can do a diff between those two tar images, let's say between two image layers. But it's a little clunky. There's a lot to read through often, so especially if it's an application install. So there's really no great way to do it. Maybe the output and the complexity of it is a reason why they haven't bothered including that yet, but at least as far as I know, there's no way to do it. If you do know, though, if there's some way you're doing it, go ahead and leave that tip in the show notes for users to go ahead and start using on their own. All right, so I've got this. Got this container. I want to save it to a new image. I'm going to actually save it to a new tagged version of my Ubuntu. So I'm going to docker commit. I'll give it a message doing version 2, and I'm going to save it to, I have to give it the name of the container, so Sleepy Stonebreaker, and I'm going to give it the name of the image that I'm going to commit it to, which is Streamweaver my Ubuntu 0.2. Give it a tag of 0.2. So it gives a SHA image back for it. So checksums it. So now if I docker images, it'll give me both tag version of the my Ubuntu. I could use either one of those tag versions. If I go over to Docker Hub, you'll see that the my Ubuntu version I was using to practice on this morning exists there. I have not committed it, or I have not pushed it yet to Docker Hub, so only the 0.1 version of that image exists in Docker Hub yet. So what's left is for me to push it. So docker push Streamweaver my Ubuntu. So it's going to go ahead, take all the layers that that need to be pushed up, and that's one of the features of layering disk images with Docker is just like Git and GitHub only deal with diffs between specific commits. This only deals with changes between specific layers. So we know already, and since I've already committed this up to Docker Hub, these previous layers already exist there. So it checks it by this hash number. It sees that it already exists up on Docker Hub and doesn't need to push any of those. It only takes this tiny bit, which is only the new directory, directory that I added and pushes that up to Docker Hub. So it creates a fast experience and reduces network traffic in general, and obviously returns the SHA-256 checksum to you to make sure that there's integrity to the disk. All right, so now having done that, if I go over to Docker Hub, I should see my new tagged image. And 0.2 is right there. And it tells you the size of the entire image, so that's fairly useful. All right. So that's the manual way of building images, which happen occasionally. I do it for a lot of throwaway images. Sometimes I put up Ubuntu images that I just like to pull down to be able to run quick things, and maybe I keep an image up there of Ubuntu that I use that has a lot of private apt-get repositories is already registered with them, so I don't have to keep doing that every time I want to install something or try it out. So I have a bunch of those, and I pull down that Ubuntu just for my own use on my desktop. That's something I often do, and these are other things around Jekyll and Nginx that I just use for personal projects. But often people will build these little images to put up there for utility purposes. You can do an automated build. I mentioned that earlier about the difference between repository types. I have these two here. So Jekyll, if I go over to GitHub, the way that workflow works, and I'll actually get into this in the Dockerfile for video that I'm going to do a little bit later. If I look at my repositories, I have one in there called Jekyll. That's that associated with that version of it. You'll see there's actually not a whole lot in here. These are actually the Jekyll files that I use to build my site, but they're not the Jekyll binaries. I install those. The Docker file just contains a bunch of commands to getting Jekyll installed and then copying in my files that I have here on disk. And if you look over in the Jekyll repository, there's just a webhook that builds that automatically over here. So my workflow is I pull down this site out of Docker Hub. I do whatever modifications I want to this site and then modify my Docker file as needed. Then I commit that to GitHub. There's a webhook there's a service hook, in GitHub that goes over, that tells Docker Hub that I have a new push to that repository. It automatically builds it for me, and you can do a few things like make sure that latest always builds out of the master branch, and then tag always comes out of your tag, your GitHub tags, and so forth. So I think it's really, it's really, because you can see there's a tag here, the 01 tag. So it's a really easy way to automate those builds. There's other ways to automate builds and commits. Often people use their continuous integration environment to make an automatic build of an image, and once that all those tests, those unit tests or integration tests work out, they push it up to their private repository or to GitHub as needed. So there's a lot of convenient tooling around sort of automating these processes to make them low bar for everybody. So one other thing I just want to say is it's tempting to think, and this is a word of caution, it's tempting to think because you can see in GitHub, excuse me, I don't need that actually, because you can see in GitHub the base image that's used, the Docker file that's used, you get a false sense of security over that image, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So looking at it, you can see what base images come, and it's easy to say that, oh, it's come from the Ubuntu latest, and it's only just done these standard Ruby repositories in apt-get, so this must be a pretty safe image to use. If you know the person is a trusted source, I think that's probably fair to say, but that's not always the case, and I don't want to get into all the specific use cases of it, but there's ways to hide and obfuscate what's going on inside a Docker image, that you could inject malicious code or do all kinds of things, give backdoors, and of course, that's aside from just normal vulnerabilities that might have existed in the base image to begin with. As you saw, even the Ubuntu base images all had some kind of vulnerability associated with them. So don't be lured into the thinking that a Docker file guarantees a certain level of security around your Docker image or container. You're still going to do due diligence of security, locking things down, penetration testing on your own on that image, although Docker file does provide a lot in terms of trying to isolate and sandbox that. They can still expose ports. Exposed ports carry over from previous versions of that image, so they might have been exposing ports in that case. And so there's a lot there that It's not as clear as it might seem when you initially start to get used to Dockerfiles, I guess is what I'm saying. So especially if you're doing kind of government image containers or containers that need a high level of security, just be aware of that and think through your kind of strategy for how you're going to build your images. All right, so that's Docker Hub. It's sort of similar, applies to private Docker repositories. You'll be doing that from command line. That's how you commit a Docker image. That's all I'm going to do here. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the show notes, and I will try to do an episode next time, I think, on a Docker file itself and cover that. So thank you for joining me today. Get out, play a little bit with Docker, and I hope you are enjoying it. Thank you.